Hello, so there's a famous quote from Nietzsche that goes, if you crush a cockroach, you're a hero. If you crush a beautiful butterfly, you're a villain. Morals have aesthetic criteria. And this sort of talks into the idea that morality is not only fickle, but it's kind of its own recursion. Now, a recursion is when a problem is solved internally by itself, with continuous feedback of slowly fragmenting the issue until it's solved. This method is kind of well known to programmers who often use like Python, and it was also quite famous in the Fibonacci sequence. I'm going to explore recursion in this little lecture, not as a coding mechanism, but as a metaphorical structure for understanding how morality processes itself. Breaking ethical problems down until they resolve or mutate into new ones. We are entering an era sort of moral ambiguity. Maybe more so than ever with postmodernity and the abstraction of that, which I spoke about in one of the previous lectures. And a sort of controversial subject I'm going to bring up, but I'm not placing an opinion on it, a personal opinion on it. I'm just using it as an example. Is the UK had just recently legalised full-term abortions up to the day of birth. Whilst this does require extraordinary circumstances to be applied, it does raise questions on ethics and morality. It is legally permissible to terminate a pregnancy up to the day of birth under extraordinary circumstances, yet one day later the same act becomes criminalised as infanticide. This is a more moral, sort of modern moral conundrum. Although nothing is new to the ambiguous ethical laws of man, but like another example of this would be in war, to kill is fine. On the streets, you're a murderer. Now, I'd just like to reiterate that this is not a political take on reproductive rights or acts in war. I'm just merely using these polarizing concepts of examples of moral ambiguity arising within society. Morality in society acts as a recursion. This is where the nuance of fragmenting an act essentially solves the ethical problem. An example of this would be to kill a child is morally wrong, and again to terminate the life of a child whose existence is the product of extreme circumstances or whose life would be heavily impeded is now justifiable legally. So there is a recursion of two kinds here. The first is the usage of the language. And this is where kind of linguistic philosophy comes into play. I would check Bertrand Russell and Wittgenstein for that sort of stuff. So kill turns to abort or terminate. Secondly, the mother, the child, or both, and their quality of life is now considered. This is all fairly obvious. Life isn't black and white, it's nuanced, it's got a lot of idiosyncrasies. There are grey areas. So with that in mind, let us take the recursion of morality somewhere slightly more complex, somewhere more in the realms of postmodernity. So with Michel Foucault, he created the idea of social constructs. It is accepted within mainstream academia and media that things traditionally thought of as absolutes are constructions or spectrums. So take gender, for example. It's a fragmentation of biological sex, or even race, or even age. Now let us take one of these. Let's take race, for example. Race is a social construct, but it is not constructed ex nihilo. It often reflects minor population level biological variations, such as skin pigmentation, which have been imbued with social meaning. The recursion arises when we acknowledge race becomes necessary to fight racism, yet doing so seems to affirm a category we know to be artificial, a social construct. It is morally wrong to be racist, but race is a social construct, so the act of being racist is both an acknowledgement of race as a reality, but also obsolete as race is socially made and therefore does not really exist in past human labels. So the recursion here is more complex, a kind of paradox of two opposing binaries. So culture is introduced, heritage, intersectionality, and further identifiers to help the eternal recursion of human morality solve the problem that racism is morally incorrect. So let's get down to the semantics. The semantics of moral recursion provide sort of a further exploration. And it's more sort of to do with linguistic games and linguistic problems here, because words have weight, and those words can change the weight of a morally unjustifiable act into a justifiable one. As George Orwell said, political language is designed to make lies sound truthful and murder sound respectable. A classic example of this can be seen within human rights, and especially human rights law, which I actually studied at university. To torture someone is illegal. However, to use enhanced interrogation techniques is perfectly legal. Propaganda becomes government messaging, or perhaps even shared realities. Will you die for two old bureaucrats who don't even know your own name? Probably not. How about your country, or for your way of life, or for your morals? Now you might consider it. Derrida sort of sees this movement of words as a signifier. It's not neutral, it's moved meaning for the recursion of linguistic expression to moral reshaping. Civilian deaths become collateral damage and necessary evil in war. Even on a less morally charged note, are you a productive member of society? Re-encoding morality until it solves itself. No matter how strong the initial problem may seem, there is either a sanitization or engorging effect going on here. Wittgenstein thought of all philosophical problems, as I said in the previous lecture, as nothing more than linguistic problems. There are no real problems. Was he right? Is morality or ethics or even philosophy just a linguistic recursion, the reshaping of a moral concept until it's a palatable sentence? Is morality, ethics, or even philosophy nothing more than a linguistic recursion as well? A process of just continually reframing the unbearable into the bearable, the unjust into the justifiable? If so, then perhaps the deepest truths of our moral world are not in the acts themselves, but in the words we choose to describe them. I hope you enjoyed this lecture, and thank you for checking out my course. AM Kent signing out.